This is the morning brief from the Economic Times.
Heat waves in Canada and the US. Record floods in Europe and Australia. Forest fires and blazes in Italy and Greece. The first climate-induced famine in Madagascar. A deadly flash flood that hurtled down a remote Indian Himalayan valley. An alarming UN climate report. A contentious global conference on climate change. 2021 raised many red flags to show the world that it's fast heading from climate change towards climate chaos.
2021 is a crucial year in the fight against climate change. According to the Paris Agreement timetable, this year governments must make key decisions on updating their climate action plans.
Heat waves, droughts, extreme precipitation, even fire. 3 degrees of warming is really disastrous.
COP26 is our last best hope to keep 1.5 in reach.
Glasgow must be the kickoff of a decade of ambition and innovation to preserve our shared future.
क्लाइमेट चेंज पर इस वैश्विक मंथन के बीच मैं भारत की ओर से इस चुनौती से निपटने के लिए 5 अमृत तत्व रखना चाहता हूं.
Green economy, blah, blah, blah. Net zero by 2050, blah, blah, blah.
The clips you just heard would give you a fair bit of an idea on why we are doing this episode today. This summer, the United Nations dropped a landmark 4,000-page climate report which alerted the world to the disasters ahead as the world is heating up and poisonous gas emissions are choking our planet.
This is a frightening report, and it needs to be read by all leaders and decision makers in the world.
The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, whom you just heard, called the report nothing less than a code red for humanity. Then, the Conference of the Parties, or COP26 in Glasgow, dubbed the last best hope for nations fighting climate change, came a cropper, changing the aim of a global phase-out of coal usage to a phase-down. Moreover, the COP26 exposed the weaknesses of developing countries like India and its dependence on the fuel. Back home, lawmakers announced incentives to increase sustainability and cut emissions. The country's biggest corporates announced billions of dollars worth of investments and even restructuring businesses to focus on green energy. In fact, it has excited the investors too. But these very same businessmen are investing in facilities that increase emissions. Are their pro-environment claims genuine and economically feasible? Listen to Climate Economics, our first of a series of year-ender episodes on what happened, what changed, what succeeded, and what failed in India in 2021. It's Thursday, the 23rd of December. I'm your host, Bhavya Dilipkumar. Climate change is basically the change in the Earth's average temperature and weather conditions. The change is rapid now as the release of greenhouse gases, mostly carbon dioxide, is increasing and trapping the sun's heat and causing the planet's temperature to go up. This leads to and aggravates all the disasters that we mentioned at the beginning of this episode. The clock is ticking. And the UN report in August 2021 told the world it doesn't have much time left.
This year, when the IPCC recently released this kind of Working Group 1 report on the physical science basis of climate change, that report is clearly showing that we don't have much time, that our trends are going very wrong, and unless in the next decade we can reduce by nearly half of what we are emitting today, which is over 36.7 billion tons of carbon dioxide and nearly 59 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, all greenhouse gases. Then the Earth has every chance that many Earth systems, climate systems, climate is not just one system. There are 9 or 10 Earth systems interconnected. Many of these Earth systems might tip over. That means they might collapse. And that is why this is very serious now.
That was Soumya Dutta, who is a climate change activist and the convener of Energy and Climate Change Group. Among other things, the UN report, which dealt quite a bit with India's extreme climate, said that by 2100, as many as 12 of India's cities may go underwater due to rising sea levels. Global surface temperature has increased faster since 1970 than in any other 50-year period over the last 2000 years. This has started costing human lives now.
Dozens of people in the Vancouver area of Western Canada have died in an unprecedented heatwave. Police say they've responded to almost 70 sudden deaths since Monday.
The heat wave across India is all set to continue over the next 2 days as well. The Met Department has predicted that the national capital Delhi will experience a maximum temperature of 41 degrees Celsius today.
Experts have stressed on the need to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is important because every fraction of a degree of warming will result in the loss of many more lives and livelihoods. And it is for this reason to determine such global targets that the COP conferences are significant. In fact, it was in COP21 in 2015 that the Paris Agreement was adopted. Countries that were part of this agreement committed to limit the global average temperature to rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and to aim for 1.5 degrees Celsius. They also committed to bring forward national plans setting out how much they would reduce their emissions, known as Nationally Determined Contributions or NDCs. They agreed that every 5 years they would come back with an updated plan that would reflect their highest possible ambition at that time. While support for the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit is accepted by everyone and has won fresh political backing in 2021, it still remains out of reach. There is carbon emission inequalities between highest emitters and lowest emitters, which is hampering any possibility to get a plan to action. The planet has already heated up by 1.1 degrees Celsius since the Industrial Revolution unleashed widespread use of fossil fuels. Now, where does India stand in its targets and achievements on sustainability? Actually, better than you'd think.
When it comes to climate change, India, though it will not seem to most people, India is actually a performer. Because what India commits in the international arena, it actually does meet. So, as far as the emissions intensity is concerned, India is on its way. In 2016, India reduced the emission intensity of its economy by 24%, which actually meant that its pre-2020 promise, the pledge it made in Cancun, was met in 2016. So what it was supposed to meet in 2020, it already met in 2016. And what it is supposed to meet in 2030, India is well on its way to doing it. Again, I would say COP26, India made certain announcements. Prime Minister Modi announced that India would achieve net zero by 2070, which is an important target. India committed to reduce its emissions in 2030 by 1 million tons. So whatever India is projecting to be its emissions in 2030, it will be minus 1 million ton.
That was my colleague Urmi Goswami, who reports extensively on climate change and policy. Urmi was at Glasgow covering the event for ET. She tells me that in comparison to countries globally, India has always achieved the climate change targets it sets.
We have seen this in the United Nations emissions gap report. It finds that India is one of the few countries and the only G20 country that will actually meet its Paris targets. So, yes, India is seen as somebody which does what it commits to do. Now, the question that arises is that does India under sort of promise and therefore it achieves? Could it have promised more? Now, there is always some argument saying that could India have promised more? Probably yes, but again, there are compulsions. India has a lot of demands on it, and that's what it always says, that it has development imperatives. And therefore it promises what it can deliver. So that's in the past. Now, what about the future? And why India is actually seen as a good actor when it comes to climate change is also its energy portfolio. The very fact that in 2014 the government committed, set a target of 175 gigawatts of, mostly solar and wind, and it was a huge target compared to not only what we had set in the past domestically, but even if you look at it globally, you don't see this kind of targets.
Despite what Urmi said, India was widely criticized in COP26 for some of its walkbacks on targets, but primarily for being non-committal to phasing out the usage of coal. Now, we all have heard about the coal debate that India got itself into. However, there were several other important debates and discussion that did not quite get the attention it needed, like net zero versus real zero plans, or giving up coal but not speaking about oil and gas.
The main debates on COP26 were very different. One of the primary tasks before COP26 and the expectations from it was that more of the major economies, those countries which emit quite a lot, forget about those small countries whose emissions doesn't really matter, but the major emission countries will be upgrading their NDCs. India has not done upgradation of NDCs. So many of the countries have done, but they have done nowhere near what is needed. So that was one of the main debate. The second main debate was the market mechanism, the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Like most countries, almost all countries have given net zero plans, not real zero plans. And net zero means even in those target dates, whether it is 2050 for most of the big economies, or 2060 for China, or 2070 for India, even in those dates, there will still be carbon dioxide emissions, other greenhouse gas emissions. That means those have to be offset. And the only mechanism that offsetting is now talking about seriously is through the market mechanism, which the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement talks about. And the third main debate was climate finance, which the rich countries, the developed countries have failed to deliver even after promising that measly amount of $100 billion per year from 2020. That has not come. So these three and the loss and damage debate was the main debates.
India has set huge targets that it would put in place 500 gigawatt of non-fossil electricity capacity by 2030, which includes solar, wind or hydro projects. While this sounds great, there are some realistic challenges to achieving this, said Soumya.
If you think of 500 gigawatt by 2030, after nearly 15 years, almost 13 and a half to 14 years of solar energy programs in India, we today have 48 gigawatts of installed solar energy capacity. 48 gigawatt. So what Mr. Modi is saying, supposing out of this 500 gigawatt, 100 gigawatt is from other sources and 400 is the solar. We'll have to have 350 gigawatt in the next 9 years. That means nearly 40 gigawatt each year. Even China has not done that. China has the world's largest manufacturing capacity on solar and wind. India has next to nothing. Most of the power plants, solar power plants that India sets up, comes from either the photovoltaic panels or the wafers and the non-assembled panels. What India has mostly is assembly. So we import either the wafer or even the panels and then do the assembly. So India needs to fast set up at a very fast pace its own solar wafer manufacturing capacity, panel manufacturing capacity, and this is not easy in 1 year. That will take time. You can set up a solar power plant in 6 months. But unless you have manufacturing capacity, you have to depend on those who will supply this. So without setting up a manufacturing base for solar, talking about ramping up randomly is just that, just talking random, it's a lot of gas. I don't think India can set up 500 gigawatt of non-fossil energy it's unfortunate. Would have been happy if that happened by 2030, but there is no way this is going to happen.
But there is always scope for improvement, right? The targets announced at the COP26 has brought sustainability into the mainstream, opening huge, attractive business opportunities for many companies. Like, for example, in June, Reliance said it is investing around 75,000 crore rupees in a green energy complex in Jamnagar, Gujarat. In September, rival conglomerate Adani Enterprises said it will invest around $20 billion or 1.48 trillion rupees over 10 years in renewable energy supply chain. Sajjan Jindal's JSW too got on the bus.
JSW Energy has stepped up its green initiatives by forming a new company for its renewable energy business. Mukesh Ambani and Gautam Adani are pumping in the big bucks, pushing India's scattered renewable energy industry to the next level and hyperfueling the country's clean energy dreams for 2030.
I caught up with Prabodha, Acharya, Chief Sustainability Officer at JSW Group, who says that COP26 commitments are pushing companies to do more.
If the Indian corporates will play a definitive role, JSW Energy has set a vision of becoming a 10 gigawatt company by 2025 and 20 gigawatt company by 2030 at an investment of around 75,000 crore Indian rupees, with all the incremental capacity additions coming predominantly from the renewable energy sources. And we will be a 7 gigawatt company by June 2023, and our renewable portfolio will increase from 33% to 80% by 2030.
So steel, cement, power companies, they form part of India's core manufacturing sector, right? And as per reports, they're the biggest contributors to carbon emissions. So we are also seeing companies, even JSW Steel, talking about bringing down emissions. But at the same time, these companies continue to invest in their existing facilities. So, I mean, isn't it ironic that way? And how do you see this?
You are right. Steel and cement sectors are the largest industrial subsector in terms of GHG emissions. It is difficult to decarbonize when it comes to steel or cement sector. And these are called, therefore, the hard to abate, since CO2 emissions are from its process itself. So to decarbonize this sector, we need to change the fundamental way of making those products. With the current technologies available, the Indian steel and cement sector, I believe, are putting specific plan to reduce their emissions. To that extent, if you see, Indian cement sector is one of the least emission intensive when you compare with the world cement sector. When you come to the steel sector also, although we are putting plans to triple our production capacity in India, but the new production facility will come more energy efficient and process efficient. So in that way, I don't see there is any conflict between growth and decarbonization in India as far as our plans are concerned.
So we have already huge existing coal-fired facilities. I mean, it's huge investment that's happening and happened in these facilities. So what happens to that? And for a country like ours, which is abundant with coal, so what does one do about the existing coal-fired facilities?
It is not only about the fuel, but we also need to look at the livelihoods too. It could have serious ramifications for certain areas of our country or states where the fossil fuels are embedded in local culture itself. So therefore, the energy transition is more than technological fixes and investment. It is also about workers and communities who will be affected. So we need to think through the strategy of transition right now. So we need to work backwards and define our strategy towards our ultimate objective as a country to become net zero by 2070. And this would include all of the considerations towards how we are switching to green power, how we build our new power transmission infrastructure, how we finance new energy infrastructure, and most importantly, the phasing down of coal productions. And to this extent, the decline will depend on how far we are developing technology like carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and that can help in continuing our fossil fuel or coal-fired facilities along with these technologies.
And Prabodha tells me that the good news is that while erasing coal is a distant dream, coal will be the slowest growing energy source in business as usual scenario going ahead.
And as per International Energy Agency's projection, coal is going to be the slowest growing energy source in the business as usual scenario called BAU scenario. They are predicting that its share of energy mix is going to fall from 44% in 2019 to 34% by 2040.
India's plans to invite bids for 4 gigawatt of electrolyzer capacity to enable green hydrogen production is creating a new business path and attracting several companies to venture and explore this area. However, green hydrogen can be tricky cost-wise.
That is relatively at a nascent stage. And yes, you can argue that they don't make economical sense right now. But then, I will compare this back to renewables. If you recollect, there was a time like 7-8 years back when solar-based power used to cost upwards of 15 rupees per unit and was clearly very expensive in comparison to coal-based power, which was at 2.5 rupees per unit. But over time, on the back of the scale and the technological advancements that we saw in solar, the cost of solar power has now come down by 85% and has become cheaper in comparison to coal. So similarly, for batteries, hydrogen, biofuels, etc., as the technologies evolve and scale comes in, I do see a potential for them becoming viable on their own, and it will make a business sense.
That was Amish Shah, Head of India Research, Bank of America Securities. Amish told me that it's not just the businesses that are finding sustainability attractive these days. Investors are more keen than ever in 2021. We had a good chat. Hear out.
Investors are definitely focusing on what we broadly call it as ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance. In fact, ESG has taken a center stage for investors while forming their investment decisions. For instance, if I were to quote one analysis of ours for this year, we have seen a total of $275 billion of equity fund inflows into global ESG-driven funds. This number is up 73% YOY, and it implies that 35% of all global equity inflows are now favoring ESG funds, and we've consistently seen that number inch up. In fact, on the back of that, one can argue that investors focusing on ESG is one of the key drivers for corporates taking these initiatives seriously.
Today, Mr. Amish, we are seeing a lot of big companies, big players entering the green power segment. But how feasible is it business-wise?
Bhavya, it depends on the technology that we talk about. So some sources of green energy is already viable, and it makes a good sense for faster transition there. For instance, let's take the case of renewable power, which I would argue that without any subsidy is already cheaper when compared to coal-based power. And this is particularly relevant when one compares the cost of power over the life cycle of a project. So please remember that renewable power projects give you power tariffs, which is the flat tariff or the same tariff over the life of 25 years, whereas the cost of coal power is inflationary. So while it might look in some cases that renewable power tariff in the first year is a little expensive than the coal-based power, but the fact is that coal-based power tariffs will keep on escalating, whereas the renewable power tariffs will remain the same. And therefore, over time, over the life cycle, renewable is much cheaper already.
Mr. Amish, so what is actually the investment needed for Indian corporates to give out some measurable changes in their emissions or further changes in their facilities? Could be anything related to bringing down carbon emissions.
At the recent COP26 event, India committed to 2 timelines and 2 different goals. So let's say the first one was to go carbon neutral by 2070, which is a pretty far off target, and it's difficult to crystallize investments required as of now. But then let's come to the relatively near-term target of 2030. 2030 is just about 9 years away. Even on a most conservative basis, India will need to do a cumulative investment of $400 billion by 2030 to achieve the 2030 targets. So obviously, these numbers will go up much further as India progresses to achieve the net neutral goal by 2070.
Moving on to something that also stood out in 2021 was sustainability linked finance. So there is green finance, green funds. So this has been there for quite some time. Some data show that even during 2017, 2016, there's been a flow of funds via green finance. But what has changed in 2021 and what can companies use this for?
Green finance as well is not a very new phenomenon. I think the inflection for raising green finance was back in 2015 when India signed the Paris Agreement and it committed to several targets at that point in time too. And then investors saw that India is quite serious on these commitments or targets, because on most of these targets, India is likely to over-deliver. Money raised has been utilized for a variety of sectors, more specifically renewable energy, telecom, industrials, the overall energy sector, material sector. So there are plenty of sectors that has raised this money. And of course, a large share of these funds have gone up to scale up renewable power capacity in India. And we have seen visible progress on that with renewable capacity now tripling over the last 5-6 years. Some green funds, I would argue, were also raised by the government entities to promote energy efficiency initiatives. And as we spoke earlier, has delivered very good outcomes.
So do you see more shareholders are holding companies accountable for ESGs as well today?
Investors are clearly reflecting their preference for ESG compliant companies, not just in India, but globally. So let's say, for instance, one analysis that we had done recently suggests that if you look at companies within Asia Pacific with the highest ESG rank, they trade at a 40% premium to the companies that have the lowest ESG rank. So clearly that valuation differential from investors is clearly visible. So I think, Bhavya, it's not going to be an option anymore. Governments also will continue to make ESG policies more stringent. I do think that companies may not want to be laggards. In fact, as we've already seen, that even before SEBI is going to mandate the emission reporting requirements, we've already had about 25 top companies in India already announce net neutral goals by themselves. So it's already happening as we speak. But obviously, in case if some company does not go through the transition, then yes, I think there will be a cost both in terms of earnings as well as lower valuations that they will earn.
There is a mindset shift in India towards going green. But these are just baby steps. For naysayers across the world, and especially in countries such as India, the year 2021 showed that problems of climate change are upon us. There is an upheaval in the forms of displacement, famines, and migration in other parts of the world. There may be a reality here too. India is meeting some targets on sustainability, but it needs to do more. While the government needs to bring strong policy changes, industrialists need to walk the talk on contributing to a greener, cleaner environment before it's too late.
So we have beginnings, the seeds of the good actions, which has not been watered, not been given sunlight, so that they can grow into trees. We need to do that in a far more sort of determined manner and with far more urgency.
Thank you so much, Prabodha, Amish, Soumya, and Urmi. You've been listening to Climate Economics, our first in a series of year-ender episodes. This episode was produced by Anirban Chaudhary from The Economic Times and Varun Kapahi from Awaaz. Sound editor, Swati Joshi from Awaaz. Executive producer, Arijit Burman. Thank you for listening. Do send in your feedback to the morning brief at timesgroup.com and do share the episode on your social media networks. The morning brief is every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. All external sound clips used in this episode belong to their respective owners. Credits are mentioned in the description box.